I'm tasked with helping to cheer you on for this final stretch. And one of the most, I think, meaningful discussions of the day, the question of how interoperability framework moves the dial for individual children and families. My name is Mary Bissell. I'm the ghost moderator. My name is not on the, on the agenda. But I'm a lawyer and a policy advocate, and I have a small child welfare policy firm called Child Focus. And in partnership with our clients and with the clients they serve, we try to build a policy pipeline between what happens on the federal level and what happens on the local level with frontline service providers and, most importantly, with the children and families that they serve. And in many ways, it's kind of the ultimate field-to-fed, fed-to-field experience. As you all know, however, I think translating those needs is no easy task. And one of the ways that we do that at Child Focus is simple, but in some ways is quite revolutionary for Washington. We bring children and families to the Hill and help raise up their voices to talk about what they need from the very systems that we're talking about. So I wanted to, we've had a lot of graphs today, and you can tell I'm a lawyer, not a data person, but I wanted to at least start the presentation with some of the children and families that have come to advocate for themselves. We've brought about 2,000 grandparents to the Hill for the Grand Rally to lobby for the Kinship Care Support Act, many pieces of which, as you know, were ultimately included in Fostering Connections. That was a particularly memorable day because we were talking to late Senator Kennedy's staff on one phone and talking to Royal Flush, the porta potty company, on the other. So we were balancing multiple priorities. But I think it's fair to say that the halls of Congress will never be the same now that once 2,000 grandparents went tromping through and demanding that their needs be met. We've also had a wonderful experience bringing current and former foster youth and a range of birth parents, foster parents, kinship caregivers to the Hill to talk with their members of Congress about what their needs were. And most recently, we have had a very, very talented group of girls, many of whom are multi-system involved in the very systems we've been talking about today. Most of whom have been sexually trafficked at some point in their lives, and who all share the experience of trauma. And what we feel we share with them is a responsibility to make sure that systems don't re-traumatize them. So in our role as kind of Hill Sherpas, as we like to call ourselves, we see without exception the unforgettable transformation that happens in these children and young people and their families. And without exception, they begin to discover, and you can see it happen throughout the course of the day. You know, they start out at the first meeting thinking, I don't really know what to say. It's very intimidating to go into the marble halls of Congress. And by the end of the day, they're definitely giving all the Hill staffers the what for in terms of what they need and what they want. And to see that transformation is really amazing. And they also start to see, I think, a value in a system that responds to their needs. They begin to invest themselves in the systems that serve them in a really profound and meaningful way. That investment and participation by children and families, in my experience as a legal aid lawyer and as a lobbyist and as a former Hill staffer, I think are really the keys to the kingdom in terms of achieving our ability to transform systems and achieve interoperability in a real, sustained, and meaningful way. And that's really the focus of this afternoon's session. What are the implications of interoperability for the children and families our systems serve, how they use those systems, and once we achieve interoperability and whatever is needed to accomplish that, are we measuring the right things? Are we just measuring our efficiency, our ability to be streamlined, our ability to collect better data? Are we really measuring the impact on the children and family and what difference that makes to their daily lives? So we have a very special panel today to address just these questions. We're thrilled to have them here. And we are proud to welcome Dr. Richard Gellis, the Dean of the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice, in the middle. here, Mr. Sid Gardner, who's the president of the Center for Children and Family Futures. And Max Shimura couldn't be with us today. Unfortunately, he had a family emergency, but we are equally pleased to have with us Tom Baden, who is the chief architect and CIO of the state of Minnesota. So I'm going to turn it over to Richard, and then we'll hear from the other two panelists and save time in the end for questions.
So, in the words of Admiral Zumwalt, who am I and what am I doing here? And in some ways, I am an outlier at this particular session because for most of my career, I was a basic researcher. For the latter 10 years, I've worked in the area of child welfare policy. I had, I will admit to having a heavy hand in the drafting and passing of the Adoption and Safe Family Act, a lighter hand on the interethnic provisions of the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, and a very minor hand in fostering connections. But my day job is to be the dean of a school that has, on any given day, 300 MSW candidates. And I have a deep responsibility to them at the clinical level to make sure that when they leave us and I shake their hands, they move into a world where they can be effective and accomplish the goals and dreams and visions they had when they wrote their essays to come to work for us. So that's how I end up on a clinical panel, when by training and by actual interest, I should have really been asked to do an earlier panel, which is more close to my training and interests. Now, because I am doing this at a clinical level, we're going to have to do something that you're going to find very uncomfortable and noxious. I want you to take out, you don't really have to take them out, most of you are using them now, your smartphones, Blackberries, iPhones, iPads, and computers. Just put them on your lap. You can keep your dumb phones, like this one. But the intelligent ones that you are so really spent the last 2 days focused on, you're going to hand to the person next to you. And they are going to hand you yours. Theirs. The only ones who can get them back are those who run human service organizations in which the organization provides the exact same instrument you have on your hand to every one of your frontline employees. So if you happen to work for one of those organizations, David, and you have given this same device to your frontline workers, you get yours back. You get it back. The rest of you, however, can get them back by giving Daniel $100. And that's it. Now, what we have accomplished, what I sought to accomplish, is that during my presentation and during Sid's and until we're done, you are to experience what it is like to be a caseworker who has no access in real time to critical, and let's admit it, not so critical information. And it's essentially impossible for me to get up and do this presentation to a group of people who cannot possibly put themselves in the place of their workers because they're spending most of their time multitasking, checking their email, checking the web, checking the budget announcements. This is not what your workers are able to do. You send them out there technologically naked, just as you are now, into a world where, and we'll get to it, what their job is. Now, before I get to that, let me give you an ecological overview of human and children's services. Because as these 2 days have unfolded, it is clear to me that the highest level of the ecosystem is well represented at the conference. What I call the macro system is very well represented here. What is the macro system? That's the feds, the states, the localities, and basic researchers. Barbara Needle and I, probably 2 of the basic researchers here. And what do? Well, the feds, from their vantage point, are involved in mandate creation, creating and maintaining funding streams, and assuring accountability. So from their vantage point, interoperability is about mandates, funding streams, accountability. And it's the same for the state. The state is concerned with its obligations, its funding streams, and its accountability. Localities are concerned about their obligations, their funding streams, and their accountability. And the research community basically lives a life in this kind of an environment, ensconced in ivy, answering basic questions and semi-practical questions. We have a very distinct and unique view of the world, and our view of interoperability is essentially defined by what we need to do our jobs, and what we need to do to convince our bosses or those who evaluate us that we are doing our jobs. Keep in mind that that is not connected in any direct way to the next 2 levels. The meso level, and a number of you are here at the meso level, you run state and county agencies. You are between the macro level and the micro level, and your concerns are generally funding, services, data collection and analysis, local IT support, quality control, and last but absolutely least, evaluating the quality of the work you're conducting. We had a conversation in Group 7 about grants and grantsmanship, and one of the things I didn't bring up because it was a little off topic was most funders, federal funders, state funders, foundation funders, private funders, set aside negligible and absolutely insufficient funding to actually carry out an appropriate evaluation of what it is you're doing. So most of the evaluations that are done at the meso level are the weakest of all possible designs, either pre-test, post-test only, or post-test only, and there's no end of havoc that is raised by drawing conclusions based on those weak designs. I'm going to talk, and I'm not going to talk all that long, actually, about the micro level, which is what Daniel asked me to come and do. And who is the micro level? Those are the supervisors, the caseworkers, the clients, and the collaterals. These are what otherwise would be labeled your frontline workers. Trust me, the macro level, the meso level, and micro level have completely different views, needs, and understandings of interoperability. So I read the White House document 3 times on Amtrak. And I would have to tell you that as interesting as it was, when you parsed it out, it is completely unintelligible to any of my students. It relates not a bit to the lives they live 3 days a week, 8 hours a day in the field. So there's a great, big, huge gap between the macro level view of what interoperability is and what I'm going to talk about today in terms of micro level interoperability. To properly frame micro level interoperability, the first thing you have to do is come to grips with what the main task of the job is of the frontline worker. And I come to this late in my career, but and I'm now not surprisingly a bit of an outlier. Although the caseworkers think their jobs are service providers and help agents and seekers of social justice, at least in child welfare, the most important task of their job has very little to do with services. Their most important task, for which they get almost no training and very little support, is that they make decisions. Their supervisor's most important job is to monitor the quality of and provide oversight to, and sometimes overrides of, those same decisions. The second task a direct service provider has to deal with, and this one is not so easily answered, who exactly is the client? In the child welfare system, most of my students believe that the client are the parents, caregivers, the people who are reported, the people who are in jeopardy of losing their children, the people whose children have been placed in foster care. And I have to remind my students periodically that they don't generally, except for Michigan and a few other outliers, call it the Family Support Agency. It's called the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, or the Department of Human Services, but it's about providing a safety net for kids who could not otherwise protect themselves. Now, this is a matter of debate. I come down on one side of it. It's really not important which side you come down on. What's important is you cannot possibly make decisions unless you know who the client is that you are making decisions about. Third component of the work of the caseworker is, this is why you're sitting here without your smartphones and you're really beginning to develop anxiety and separation problems. What information do I have on which to make a decision? They have their senses. They can see, they can hear, they can smell, they can touch. Rarely do they have to taste. But in child welfare work, keep in mind that olfactory risk assessment is a very major part of how they make decisions. How homes smell, how children smell, how caregivers smell, is a highly weighted and completely uncorrelated variable that's used to make decisions. So is sight, so is hearing, so is touch. And experience is, and you've heard me yesterday over in the corner, experience is vastly overweighted as information to help make decisions. I don't know whether I should do this or not. Since Max isn't here, I'll probably take the 2 minutes to do this. We're not in Hartford, but Hartford is the insurance capital of, well, was the insurance capital of the world. It's where I send my money to insure my home and my life and my automobile. So let's take my automobile. Let's say the insurance companies of Hartford, through some quirk, ended up running America's child welfare systems. And through some quirk, America's child welfare system moved to Harvard and started running the insurance business. So this is how my automobile insurance would be determined. A 26-year-old art history major with a cell phone would pull up in front of my house, knock on the door and say, "Hi, I'm from the Hartford, and I'm going to set your insurance rate for your 2005 Prius. First, I'd like to sit down and talk to you and your wife. I'd like to look around the house, but most importantly, I want to walk around and look at the Prius. I want to see what the inside looks like. I want to see what the outside looks like. I want to see how many dents there are. I want to see what it smells like on the inside. My particular car, my wife has a bad habit of leaving apple cores behind. So the car's now almost 6 years old, and it has a distinctive aroma to it after she's driven it. And after this visit, our 26-year-old art history major is going to go back to Hartford and tell her supervisor, well, I think, given how that car looked and how nice those people were dressed and that there was food in the refrigerator, that we should charge them $450 a year. Now, the fact that I live in Center City, Philadelphia, the fact that breaking into cars and stealing things is considered a daily and evening sport, the fact that my car is vulnerable to every lunatic who tries to parallel park in the city of Philadelphia because we park on the street, that won't go into the equation. Neither will my age, neither will my sex, neither will whether my children who come home on vacation drive the car. It's all going to be based on that home visit. How long do you think the American insurance business would be in business if that was the way they made decisions? Personally, I don't think they'd be in business very long. But this is exactly the mechanism by which we make decisions that concern the life and death and well-being of families and children. Fourth, which is sort of tied to the third, how do I go about making decisions? Given the data I have, how do I process it? Now, someone brought up structured decision-making yesterday, and it's not a bad instrument if it's done the right way. But more often than not, when I interview caseworkers, the caseworkers have figured out a perfect way to defeat the whole system. It's called back entering. Use it 8 or 9 times. They know what the items are. And they decide, well, a medium risk is going to be a score of 19. So I'll put in 19, and then I'll back enter the numbers so it adds up to 19. They don't front end the numbers and take the score as it's given. They're still using, even with structured decision making, unfortunately, they're still using what they believe in, and that's clinical judgment. And lastly, what the workers don't get, what I brought up yesterday, and I thought the answer from the folks in New York was really quite good. What kind of mistake am I allowed to make? In any decision you make in human services, 3 things can happen and 2 of them are bad. The obvious one good thing is you make an accurate decision. But the other 2 possible outcomes is you make a false positive. You take a child out of a home who doesn't otherwise need to be taken out of a home. You place a child in care that doesn't otherwise need to be placed in care. You terminate parental rights that don't otherwise need to be terminated. And the second mistake is the false negative. You under-respond to danger and risk, and after the initial decision is made, something awful or tragic happens to the child. Now, in child welfare, before I get off this topic, If you look at child welfare as a researcher, as I do, from the point of view of decision-making, as I do, you come to the conclusion that it is the most organizationally schizophrenic social service organization ever created. How can you come to that conclusion? Well, I didn't bring the PowerPoint because most of you know the data. 6 million children, according to the latest data that came out from the Administration of Children and Families, 6 million children were involved in a little less than 3 million reports of suspected child abuse and neglect in 2009. Of the investigations that were carried out, in excess of 60% were found to be unsubstantiated and were closed, maybe with the offering of voluntary services, but probably not. The other, depends on your state, between 25 and 40% of the cases were substantiated. Half of those cases were closed within 48 hours and offered only voluntary services. So now you're looking at about close to 80% of the investigations that are carried out yield nothing but no service other than an investigation. It's not something people are going to sign up for. There is no research. Let me underscore this 1,000 times. There is no research that would support a hypothesis that claims that an investigation has a deterrent function for anyone. It is a belief that we've held since 1974 when we passed Captor, but it's an essentially untested belief. No one has been able to demonstrate that sending a 26-year-old art history major out to a house to claim that someone has abused their children and puts them through an investigation, and when they close the door and leave, that somehow the child is safer than the child was before the 26-year-old art history major showed up at the front door. Why do we do this, and why have we done this? Well, upwards of 30 years. And the answer is simple. It almost came out yesterday. I expected it to come out yesterday, but it certainly comes out outside of this room. We have to investigate all of these cases because otherwise some child might get hurt and the media boogeyman would come back to us and say, you should have investigated this case. So what does that mean from my point of view? It means that at the very front door of the system is false negative sensitive. It doesn't want to commit a false negative, and therefore it commits the resources of the system, most of which come from the taxpayers' local taxes, to carrying out investigations, 80% of which produce nothing. No help, no service, no deterrent effect, zero. And one could argue, as some have, again, without data, that it's possible that in deploying those resources for investigations, you're actually taking them out of the system and not using them for service provision or safety. Again, an untested hypothesis, but nonetheless a hypothesis that bears some consideration. The minute the investigator leaves the office, the system now becomes false positive sensitive. How else could you explain a substantiation rate of 38%? Where's the judges? The judges know the answer to this. There has to be probable cause. It has to be more likely to be true than not to substantiate an allegation of child abuse and neglect. And there are a lot of moving parts because most of these cases are neglect. And in those moving parts, there is a tendency imposed by law, imposed by the Supreme Court, imposed by practice, imposed by culture, not to over-report, over-substantiate child abuse and neglect. Literally in the space of 24 hours, the system makes its 180-degree turn. It goes from false negative sensitive to false positive sensitive with absolutely no data, no rationale, no theory behind it other than the famous quote, but this is the way we've always done it. New York is the first time, the absolute first time, that I've heard a state willing to embrace using data and interoperability to take the gargantuan leap to reduce investigations so that the whole system became false positive sensitive from beginning to end. Brian talked about this morning about reduction of foster care. Reducing the number of kids going into foster care may or may not be a good metric, but it does tell you that when the system is willing to do that, the system has become false positive sensitive. So if you reduce the number of investigations you do, if you minimize the substantiations, and you hold a very high threshold of putting children into foster care and a very high threshold of leaving them in foster care, the system at least becomes consistent. What can interoperability do? Judge Martin asked me that in November, and I had to very quickly come up with an answer. Now I've actually written it down. One, you have the very real possibility of reducing the number of investigations we carry out. Keep your eye on New York. New York may be the forerunner of a system where we might get 6 million children reported, but we're much more intelligent and much more thoughtful, much more nuanced and much more evidence-based in which ones we respond to an investigation. There's no law that says you can't respond to the other ones with a home health visitor or with another arm of the system. But to put them through a full-bore investigation when it has a less than 4 out of 10 chance of being substantiated and and an 8 in 10 chance of delivering those services makes very little sense. Interoperability allows something to happen that frankly hasn't happened in the 40 years I've been doing research on child welfare and child abuse and neglect, and that is the possibility of a real actual connection between research and child welfare decision making. It doesn't astound me anymore. It doesn't upset me anymore that the reality is those of us who do research on the causes and consequences of child abuse and neglect have no influence whatsoever on how decisions are made in the child welfare system. Again, because I have a minute or two of time, I will skewer my favorite skewer du jour, which is family group decision making. In Philadelphia, the commissioner before the current commissioner got a report from the oversight panel that said families ought to be more involved in the decision making. That's all it said. And somehow that got translated into, we should adopt family group decision making. And they put out a bid for $500,000 to a community agency that would organize family group decision making. And it ended up, given the number of cases they did, they spent $25,000 per case to try out family group decision making. Well, I basically give the family the $25,000, you probably get a better outcome than what you're going to get. But I didn't say that. What I basically said was, you do understand that there is absolutely no research, none, zero, nada, going back to New Zealand, where it was created but never studied. Susan, hold yourself together. Susan is the Deputy Commissioner of the Philadelphia Department of Human Services, in charge of quality control. But she came to work after this was done, so... This disconnect can be incredibly wasteful. But more than that, it can create a sense of failure among your frontline workers. Because they're told it's going to work. They're told it's the magic bullet. And then it doesn't work for them, and they figure, well, there's something wrong with me, I quit. Well, there's no reason to think it was going to work. And worse, the family might think there's something wrong with them. Well, why? This thing never worked in the first place. Why is it going to work on you? It might work. As Bill Clinton said about his golf game when he broke 80, I'll leave the rest of the sentence out. And they said, how did you break 80? He says, even a blind squirrel will find an acorn every once in a while. Now, when I apply that to the child welfare system, I say even a blind squirrel will find an acorn once in a while. It doesn't necessarily mean he can see. The combination of the research that's been done for the last 40 years and interoperability, the ability to take data on children and families and, pardon the expression, mine that data, run it through regression analyses to determine which variables are the best predictors of whatever outcome you choose, is for the first time ever close to the hands of people who run child welfare agencies. I began talking about this 10 years ago, and it was quite theoretical. It was you're looking at your, did you not give that to the other person?
No, I gave it to my staff, so I got it back.
Did your regular, oh, you did? Okay, then you're fine. In fact, you don't have to pay any attention at all. You're so far ahead of the curve, you can go get something to eat. You have the real possibility to do what New York is doing now, to jump and leap over structured decision making, so that in real time, your workers get their BlackBerries back, or their iPhones back, or their iPads back, and it gives them actual information. Who has, I have this Prius that has a GIS system in it. Anybody have one of these things? I use it all the time. And I don't know how I did it, and I don't know how to turn it off, but it has a breadcrumb feature. Does anybody know what a breadcrumb feature is? It leaves little dots behind me. So I drove up to Valley Forge last Friday night, and if you've ever been in Philadelphia, what you don't want to do on a Friday night is ever get on the Schuylkill Expressway. And a 20-minute drive turns into a 3.5-hour drive. So I drove the back way with the lady telling me which way to go. And I get to Valley Forge, and I stay there, and I have dinner, and now I have to go home. And I thought, how the hell am I going to go home? I don't even know how I got here. And I thought, well, I'm going to do it the hard way. I'm not going to press home and have her take me home. I'm going to see if I follow the breadcrumbs, and they're going to take me home. I turned the car on, and all I did is follow the breadcrumbs, the little dots. And I thought, imagine if the supervisor could do that with the workers. There wouldn't be a question anymore like there was in Florida 2 weeks ago whether the worker actually showed up at the house or not. When Cindy Lederman reamed out the worker, who for multiple times claimed he'd gone to the house and never does, in the case of the twins, one who was killed and one who was badly injured, Cindy was just guessing he didn't go to the house. Nobody had any proof. Now, I called up Florida, and I said, don't you guys have handheld devices? And they said, yeah, we have handheld devices. I said, are they interoperable? They said, what? So there's room for improvement, but the improvement is really just around the corner. Not to mention how safe the worker will feel. You know, periodically my students come in and tell me about the child welfare worker or the social worker was killed by a client, and they didn't find the body for 48 hours. That, you can't prevent the killings. What you can do is improve worker safety. So the last thing that interoperability can do, next to the last thing, is improve caseworker monitoring and supervision vis-a-vis out-of-home placement. Now, the last item. I brought this up when I walked in yesterday. The Wharton School at Penn raised its tuition 3.5%. and gave every incoming executive MBA student an iPad. I just gave every one of our faculty an iPad last Friday. I intend to give every one of our students coming in an iPad beginning at least next year, if not the year after. They're going to have what you have, and they're going to know a hell of a lot more about how to use it than any of us in this room know. They're the digital generation. They're your next cohort of employees. So one of the suggestions yesterday was get on the health train. You want to have a workforce that's competent and capable and willing to stay with you. You better catch up, because I can guarantee you my students are willing to take the horrible salaries you're willing to give them. They understand that. It came with the territory when they applied to go to school. What really bugs them, and they come back shaking their head about, is the archaic technology and inability to muster information that they need to do their jobs. The time is very short. So it's sort of the opposite of what we heard this morning about the digital divide keeping people out of the workforce in southern Florida. What you have to worry about now is, unless you catch up, unless you give your workers the tools that they absolutely need and expect, you won't be able to hire or keep a workforce that will allow quality work to be carried out. Well, thanks.
I'm going to try to make the case that interoperability will happen best to the extent that we have it connected with real customers, real clients, real consumers in very discrete groups that we can talk about in very concrete ways. And I'm going to do that by talking about two sets of clients in particular, those affected by the CAPTA IDEA intersection between the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act requirements for reporting and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was written to connect but mostly doesn't, and creates an extraordinary opportunity to respond to 600,000 children a year who are born, which means that cumulatively there are over 11 million children in this country who were prenatally exposed to drugs or alcohol. That's opportunity number one, and it's by definition interoperable. That problem doesn't belong to anybody. It doesn't belong to CAPTA. CAPTA is just one of the handles for grabbing hold of it. But it doesn't belong to hospitals or child welfare. Most of those customers never get to the child welfare system until much later in their lives. It's an extraordinary opportunity. Second piece I'm going to talk about even more briefly, the regional partnership grants that belong to ACF, funding that came out of the Children's Bureau, and that are now in their fourth year of interoperable connections, typically between a child welfare agency, a treatment agency, a dependency court, or a family drug court, which are charged with and funded to work together using multiple funding streams, starting with Children's Bureau money, but adding in most cases, in the 52 grants involved, leverage funding from all over the federal and state and local array of funding. So that's my case. I get to this first premise, the idea that we can't sell interoperability at the level that we need to unless it's about real customers, both by listening to and reading the current dialogue under the heading of interoperability, and also by turning the clock back. I regret that Michael J. Fox is not here to do his Back to the Future routine, but in 1965, I was involved in my first encounter with service integration. At that point, it was called the Community Action Program. It purported to be about helping localities to take a bunch of different federal funding streams and put them together in a coordinated way to make an impact on outcomes at the community level. A year or two later, Model Cities Act came along and invented some of the very tools we were talking about an hour and a half ago. but may have lost touch with. We may be, this is a point I make often enough, I'm going to get a little sign and say ahistorical and just raise the sign and wave it a little bit, but we may be a bit too ahistorical. Some of the tools that you talked about today that are within the hands of ACF today, or have been, are 30 or 40 years old. We ought to know what happened good and bad with Model Cities Supplemental. We ought to know the history of the Neighborhood Services Program as it tried to put funding streams together. We ought to make sure we understand the 4E waivers and other attempts in the past, both recent and way, way back, to make sure that we don't skip over any of that history in which some things were done right. It's hard for me to believe that over the course of those 46 years we always got it wrong. I can tell you we made a ton of mistakes, but that's all the more reason you shouldn't make them again. And if we don't digest those with some care, if we pretend all this began 5 or 10 years ago, we may well miss some important things. So that's how I get to the premise. Then I say, I want to know who this is about. And the Miami-Dade presentation this morning was extraordinary in talking about some very specific clients, community college, marginal successes, much more likely to be successful, $300 million of income that was targeted. Absolutely what I'm talking about, a specific, sizable, significant, non-token group of clients targeted with a rationale behind it. That's exactly what I'm talking about. These kids who are prenatally exposed, the reason I take the new Captor legislation, which was just amended last year and signed by the President, and is now in ACF's hands. The reason I take that is that there could be no group imaginable who more need interoperability and whom we have a better chance to start earlier in their lives than these 600,000 babies. Now, parenthetically, much longer conversation, we're learning more and more about the degree to which the million or so miscarriages are significantly correlated with prenatal exposure also. And if you cared about that problem, you'd be worrying even more about prenatal exposure. But CAPTA says very simply that a state that takes CAPTA money, not much money, arguably the requirements are almost more trouble than the money is worth, a state that takes CAPTA money must report all drug affected or, new amendment, alcohol affected to the extent that an FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, diagnosis is possible, must be reported to Child Protective Service with no presumption whatsoever that abuse or neglect has happened, but with a very clear policy presumption that that mom needs help and that that baby almost certainly needs help and that that baby deserves it about as much as any imaginable client. Who could be more innocent and more deserving? And what we know through neuroscience and brain studies and development and good programs that do early intervention right, what we know more and more of day by day is that early intervention, early identification and early intervention really can make an enormous difference. And when we miss it, those kids are still going to come back in the caseload, but it'll be 3rd or 4th grade when they get big enough and loud enough to disrupt a classroom, and we'll shunt them off to special ed. When we knew before they were born that that family needed help, we moved them off to special ed. That's what CAPTA represents, not a more intrusive way to approach private decisions made by individuals, a recognition that with good prenatal screening, parenthesis, Medicaid in most of the communities we're talking about covers 50% of all births. 60% now in Louisiana. National norm, 42, 43%. With that kind of lever, why doesn't Medicaid require prenatal screening for substance exposure? See if it does in your jurisdiction. See then what the AFCARS number is, and the Children's Bureau can tell you, or your local child welfare agency can tell you, what the number is reported for parental substance abuse that was the cause of removal of a child. That's a big number. And it ranges in reporting from a state that reports 4%, 4% of its kids going into foster care were affected by substance abuse, a number no one believes, all the way up to 66%, which tells you how variable the states are in their performance on that issue. And this is one of the places where we can't blame Congress, where we can't say, you know, Congress has these subcommittees and categorical and interest groups run the show. Because when they amended CAPTA, when they put CAPTA in place the first time, they changed IDEA, the legislation over on the education side that governs the front end of special education, the Part C agencies. And the other CAPTA requirement is that all 0 to 2-year-olds in substantiated cases of abuse or neglect must be referred to the Part C agency, the agency that handles early intervention. So we go into states and localities and we ask 2 simple questions. What's your CAPTA count for referrals based on drug-affected births? And what's your CAPTA count on referrals to the Part C agency? There are no states or localities that we've yet found that has an accurate and current count for both, and there's nowhere in the federal government that those numbers are added up. It's on the books. It was just amended to add alcohol and better language requiring that the count be reported annually to ACF. That sounds like a pretty good lever to me, an extraordinary opportunity. Now, I don't think there's anyone here from the Children's Bureau. Brian left. I don't believe there's anybody here from the Bureau. Okay. The Bureau and ACF writ large has an extraordinary opportunity on CAPTA as it links with IDEA. Just to give you another sense of the number, I talked about 600,000 total prenatal exposed births. That's based on some national studies that Ira Chasnoff, MD, pediatrician in Chicago, has done, work he's done in California, state studies, and some county surveys as well. But the 0 to 2-year-old victims in substantiated cases, that's 187,000 kids. That's not a tiny number. Knowing what your state's piece of that, 0 to 2, in substantiated, those kids are all entitled to at least a screening by the Part C agency. They won't all get in. Part C agencies in California, we call them regional centers, they're called different things around the country, are pretty good at keeping those kids out of the caseload. And that's a separate debate about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but they are all entitled to a screening. So how many screenings did your child welfare agency ask the Part C agency for last year? Those kids desperately need early identification and early intervention. And most agencies aren't even counting the referrals, much less making them effectively. Narrow it down to foster care, I've got about 84,000 0 to 2-year-olds in foster care. So these aren't massive numbers, and as Brian Samuels said, foster care is going down, but there's some evidence that as the caseload shrinks, the younger children are remaining a larger and larger part of it. The numbers I just cited are 27% of all victims, 27% of all substantiated victims are 0 to 2 years old. 19.8% of all the kids in foster care are 0 to 2 years old. Priority customers needing interoperability. They need prenatal screening. They need the hospital to pay attention in a way different from most hospitals. They need the child welfare agency's front end to be aware if differential response or in-home services. They need the new home visiting investments that HRSA and ACF are so intimately involved in to be targeted on those kids. States are right now making their mind up whether or not substance exposure will be a triggering factor for home visiting, for the allocation of $1.5 billion, the largest investment the federal government has made in home visiting over the next 5 years. Golden opportunity. Second opportunity, and the other thing I wanted to mention is that a group of the national stakeholder organizations, the AMA, the pediatricians, ACOG, College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, 0 to 3 ourselves, Dr. Chasnoff and others are meeting already to try to answer the question, what would good implementation of the new CAPTA regulations look like? And that's another of those areas where we will be coming back to a conversation with ACF, hopefully. The second arena I wanted to talk about very quickly, the regional partnership grants are $145 million allocated over 5 years to 52 sites. Lisa Rieger, who's here from the Cook Inlet Tribal Council, which is one of the 52, which put together treatment agencies, child welfare agencies, dependency courts, and other agencies needed to do serious interoperability collaboration around the needs of abused, neglected children whose parents have substance abuse problem. Passed in the congressional hyper-attention is a word I shouldn't use but will, to meth. A significant number, but not all of the children who are coming into those programs are affected by meth. Meth users tend to be polydrug users and alcohol users as well. So the meth is not the most important handle, but that's why the Congress passed it. And some of those programs are doing work so good, though the outcomes that we've compiled going into year 4 aren't yet released by the Children's Bureau, so good that their improvement over comparison groups and in a few places over statewide or countywide baselines represent extraordinary progress. Not all 52, but those that are doing the best job have shown that when you put those agencies together and they share data, and they have, some of them have invented far more innovative project-specific data systems than we've ever seen on the ground, but they're having a tremendous amount of difficulty. Witness the SACWIS conversation down at the other end, drawing information about their project from the legacy systems of SACWIS and make sure that blame goes around not only SACWIS, but the NOM system, the treatment information system over on the SAMHSA side, also could do a better job of tracking that kind of data. So it's a large, as these things go, investment that's been made. Some of those projects are taking interoperability as seriously as a county or state project with $500,000 a year for 5 years, the typical grant level. They don't have large numbers of clients. On average, they're serving 85 or so kids a year. But in total, they're already, at the beginning of year 4, they've already served 15,000 children. Now, that's a large data set of children with comparison or control groups for all of them. That's a large group of children that we know a lot more about in terms of whether reunification happened quicker, whether dependency drug courts, 20 of those projects are dependency drug courts, family drug courts, and we're learning from those 20. There's a lot more we can learn and will from doing data matching, but it will require looking at treatment data in the behavioral health system and child welfare data drawn from SACWIS and other localized systems in order to make a picture that's complete. Telling only the child welfare story or only the treatment outcome story isn't what those projects are about. It has to be interoperable by definition. So it's important that those projects be watched, tracked, ranked, and that the best of them continue. And plans are underway for discussing that, but as you can tell from the newspapers, the federal government is not in the business of renewing every grant program. This one had a 5-year cycle with a 6th year added on for evaluation, and we'll see what happens. But it is an opportunity to, if all 52 of those disappeared, there would be some major losses. If the best 25 stayed alive, and some of them have done such a good job on taking sustainability seriously and documenting their costs that they will and they should stay alive. Let me wrap up. The technical part of interoperability has mattered. It matters in the CAPTA arena that I've talked about. It matters in the regional partnership grants that I've talked about. When you come right down to the individual baby who has just been born or the mom who has just screened positive for prenatal exposure, we know that at that moment we're talking about a client, a specific client. Whether the data system is there, is interoperable, pays attention to what that mom needs and the full array of services, knows whether she had a prior substance-exposed birth, which is sadly often the norm. Whether those data pieces are in place is anybody's guess. Typically not. That's the opportunity to build on that moment of focus on a single client, multiplied 600,000 times, who goes out into the rest of the service system and will show up in all these systems for a long time, for many years to come. So the technical part matters, but developing trust among agencies, developing trust on the part of that mom that if she tells the truth about use, good things will happen for her and her baby, not bad things. Both kinds of trust, interagency trust, and mom and dad trusting that good things will happen if they tell the truth. Both of those are as important as the technical piece. So I think there's some great opportunities. I've enjoyed very much listening to this conversation and hope this is a useful add-on to it.
How the heck can we go into IT at this point of the day and keep our eyes open? I'm not really sure. But I've really, don't worry, I've trimmed the presentation down to 17 hours, 45 minutes, and we'll get started talking about XML schema standards for interoperability. Here we go. Actually, when I came here the very, very first day, had an incredibly humbling experience, thinking about the fact that I'm a propeller head and thinking about cloud computing and the fact that our flight got canceled and we took this little flight up to White Plains and it was a twin prop plane, so the propellers get tied in, and we went for a rough ride. It was a rough ride. And to tie that into the cloud, I think a lot of our initial cloud computing initiatives are going to be a lot like that. There were many people that were nauseated. There were many people that prayed for their life. And by the time we got to the ground, I actually wanted to hug the pilot because I was thinking quite happy. But actually, cloud computing, in a sense, and how it all ties into this is very important. The distinguished gentleman that talked before us talked about the fact that our systems are going to be used by incredibly technically sophisticated people. And frankly, in Minnesota, and I know many states share this pain, many of our systems predate email. So the new things that we're building are, hey, is there an Atari programmer out there? Pong needs an update. It's really frightening. To boot, the rest of the industry, you know, our friends from Microsoft, our friends from IBM, all these wonderful technical people that are out there, I'm watching the rest of the industry move from monolithic, big mainframe, tightly coupled, so tightly coupled we can't change to save our life. Very expensive, high risk to replace, exit barriers that are frightening for everybody that replaces those systems. Many of our private industry friends have moved well beyond that into service-oriented architectures, not so tightly coupled systems. But actually, the world has even gone a step further, and we're still back at the tightly coupled mainframe. Where the world's going now is really going, maybe there's a piece that's run over here on the cloud. Maybe there's a piece run over here by one state. Maybe there's a piece over here run by another state. Maybe there's data over there, systems over there, systems over there. I look at my iPod this morning, and I transferred a little money over so I could go out to dinner tonight. And the interesting story behind my bank was, I've got an iPod app that works wonderful for it. I can access it through the internet. It works just great. I've got all these wonderful little functions that I can do. But you know what's on the back side of that bank? I know the architect real well. A COBOL vSAM system that's the workhorse of their bank. So we've got these older technologies, but it doesn't mean we're pinned into a corner, and it doesn't mean that we can't move. In fact, we have to move. We have to move. That's the one thing I've heard from everybody here the whole time is, this is our opportunity, this is our chance, this is our time to do it, the time to do it's right now. Many of our friends in the federal government have given us in the state incredible opportunity to do this. I look at the information exchange and the eligibility funding and the 90-10 funding that Mr. Friedman's provided and the leadership to really drive MITA forward. I look at the leadership that Kim and Dave and you guys are working to take that framework and extend it across the rest of human services. Our friends at SAMHSA taking that same approach. So how do we do it? One piece at a time. What did Vivek Kundra say in his 25-point plan? 6-month deliverables, 6-month deliverables, 6-month deliverables, cloud first, all of those components. We need to shift our time frames from, gosh, it's going to be 5 years, $150 million. Our technology will be old, the business model will have changed, but it'll be certified and in, to Kevin Dolan, I want to call you up. Can we have a health and information exchange up in 2 weeks that crosses state boundaries, that can happen, that's cost effective and effective? IBM, can I have an iLog rules engine in 6 weeks that does 20 of our federal programs, and those rules are already pre-developed by somebody else, and we can interface it with a Java app, a .NET app, services that can be exposed to the enterprise service bus, and oh, by the way, broken down in such a way, such functional decomposition that no matter how our business processes change, or no matter how those business processes happen in the future, because we know they're going to change, that we can actually rearrange those functions and adapt our business process without having to reinvent the wheel. And oh, by the way, we're never going to rip and replace again. We're just going to replace, buy, and move these new pieces in and become an agile government organization. Starting with a business architecture that encompasses all of health and human services. Earlier, one of the questions was asked, and Kim and I were talking about it last night over dinner, is that, well, they need to be based on performance metrics. And I thought back immediately to the federal enterprise architecture, and what was their first model? It was the performance model. First, let's figure out what we're going to do and what we need to know to make sure that we're doing it. Then design our business around it. Build our services and functions to enable that to happen, make sure that we've got the data foundation and the data management in place to accomplish it, and we'll be set. We'll get started on it right away. Most of all, what I've heard from everyone and what I've learned from everyone over the course of this conference, and believe me, this conference is very inspiring to me, that it's a science, but it's an art. That it's business, it's the business of what we do, but it's technology. And those are really two sides of the same coin. That technology can influence business, and business certainly influences technology. So really, it's two sides of the same coin. We really need to be in it together. There are people that cross over that fuzzy line between the two, and Ivan and I were talking a little earlier, and we're going, we needed more techie people to be listening to what's going on because we got to make this stuff real. We need more of us to have our ears here so we can understand and have a rich understanding so we can make them happen. It's facts, but it's also intuition. It's setting a course, but it's also being able to correct that course quickly and agilely, not in 5 years or 10 years when we have to do our big rip and replace. It's the inspiration of individuals like these gentlemen and many folks that are out there, but it's also the combined inspiration of people like this group that bring perspectives from so many angles that can come together and go, that's what we're going to fix next. That's what we're going to fix next, and make it happen. Daniel, thank you so much for letting me come in here and pinch hit, and thank you all for letting me be a part of this. Appreciate it very much.